That word doesn't mean what you think it means. The voice was soft, almost lost beneath the quiet clink of silverware and the low hum of a piano drifting through the restaurant. But it carried just enough weight to pause the conversation at table 12 for half a second, not long enough to matter, not yet, because Daniel Hayes didn't even look up from the contract in front of him, his pen hovering above a line written in elegant Arabic script, the kind of script he had practiced just enough to impress, never enough to understand, and across. From him sat two investors in tailored suits, their expressions polite, unreadable, waiting for him to sign what would become one of the largest energy deals in the Southwest, a deal worth more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. And still, he didn't look up. Not when the voice spoke again, slightly firmer this time. Sir, that word, it changes the entire clause, because to him, it was just background noise, like the waitress refilling water glasses or clearing plates, invisible, interchangeable, irrelevant. And Daniel Hayes was not a man who entertained interruptions, especially not from someone in a black apron and low heels, standing just a step behind his chair, but something in the tone lingered, not loud, not urgent, just certain, and certainty had a way of cutting through arrogance, even if only for a second. So he exhaled slowly, set his pen down, and finally turned his head just enough to glance at her. Clara Whitmore, though he didn't know her name yet, didn't care to. Only saw a young woman in her late 20s, hair pulled back neatly, posture straight, eyes steady in a way that didn't quite match the role she was playing. And for a brief moment, something flickered in his expression, not recognition, not respect, just mild irritation sharpened by curiosity. Do you always interrupt business meetings? Or is this a special occasion? He said, his voice calm, controlled, the kind of calm that carried authority without needing to raise itself. And a few seats away, one of the investors shifted slightly, sensing the change in tone, sensing the imbalance of power that had just tilted ever so slightly, because Clara didn't step back, didn't apologize immediately like most would, didn't shrink under the weight of a billionaire's gaze. Instead she held it, just for a breath longer than expected, and said, only when the mistake costs more than the meal. And the words landed quietly, but they landed, like a glass set down just a little too firmly on marble, not enough to shatter, just enough to be heard. And for the first time, Daniel Hayes closed the contract, his fingers resting on the page, his eyes narrowing just a fraction as he studied her more carefully now, not as staff, not as background, but as a variable he hadn't accounted for, and that, more than anything, annoyed him, because Daniel Hayes didn't like variables. He eliminated them, controlled them, or ignored them. And this one, standing barely 5 feet away, had just stepped into his world without permission. You're a waitress, he said, not as a question, but as a statement meant to restore order, to remind both of them where the line was drawn. And you're discussing contractual language you probably can't even read. And there it was, the shift, subtle but unmistakable, a few heads turning now, a pause in the piano, or maybe it just felt that way, because the air had changed, tightened, like something unseen had entered the room, and Clara didn't flinch, didn't lower her gaze, didn't rush to correct him. Instead her fingers rested lightly against the edge of the table, steady, controlled, as if grounding herself in a moment she had lived before, somewhere else. Somewhere far from this restaurant with its warm lights and polished floors. And when she spoke again, her voice was even softer than before, but clearer, sharper. I can read it, she said. And then, almost as an afterthought, fluently. And Daniel let out a short, humorless breath, a quiet laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes, because to him, this was absurd, a performance, maybe even a joke, something to be dismissed, and yet, he didn't dismiss it, not immediately, because something in her stillness unsettled him. The way she wasn't trying to prove anything, wasn't asking for permission, wasn't even raising her voice, and around them, the restaurant seemed to lean in, conversations lowering, glances lingering just a second longer than usual, as if everyone sensed that something small had just begun, something that hadn't revealed itself yet, but would. And Daniel leaned back in his chair, crossing one arm over the other, studying her now. With open skepticism, then enlighten me, he said, the faintest edge of challenge slipping into his tone. What exactly did I get wrong? And for a moment, Clara said nothing, just looked at the contract, then back at him. And in that silence, there was no hesitation, no fear, just a quiet kind of certainty that didn't belong to someone who was supposed to be invisible. And somewhere between the soft glow of the chandelier and the steady rhythm of the piano, the line between who was speaking and who was supposed to listen began to blur, just slightly, just enough to matter. Clara did not reach for the contract. Not yet. As if she understood that the moment was not about paper or ink, but about whether he was willing to listen at all. And Daniel watched her with that same measured skepticism, expecting hesitation, expecting uncertainty, expecting the quiet retreat that usually followed when someone realized who he was. But it did not come. Instead, she tilted her head slightly toward the document and said, "The word you used there," her finger hovering just above the line without touching it. "It does not mean partnership. It means obligation, permanent, non-negotiable obligation." And one of the investors across the table straightened in his chair, his expression tightening just a fraction, while Daniel's jaw set, not in anger, not yet, but in resistance, because this was not how his meetings went. This was not how his authority was challenged, especially not by someone who had just been refilling water glasses minutes ago. "That is not what my translator said," he replied, his tone still controlled but carrying a sharper edge now. And Clara gave a small nod, almost as if she had expected that answer. "Your translator used a modern interpretation," she said, and then, without warning, she switched languages, her voice flowing into Arabic so naturally that the syllables seemed to settle into the room like something familiar, something precise. And the two investors looked at each other immediately, one of them leaning forward, listening closely. Now, not to Daniel, but to her, and she continued for a few seconds, calm, measured, then paused and translated back into English. "He is saying that if you sign this, you will be bound to supply at a fixed rate for 10 years, regardless of market changes." And the silence that followed was no longer subtle. It was present, deliberate, stretching across the table like a line no one wanted to cross without thinking. And Daniel's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the contract. Because he understood numbers, he understood risk, and what she had just described was not a small error. It was the kind of clause that could cost hundreds of millions over time. And still, pride moved faster than logic. "Anyone can memorize a few phrases," he said, dismissively. Though his eyes had not left hers, and Clara did not argue, did not defend herself. She simply shifted again, this time into French, her pronunciation precise, elegant, correcting another section of the agreement, then into Russian, identifying a secondary clause that contradicted the first, each transition seamless, each explanation brief, controlled, as if she was not trying to impress anyone, only to clarify what was already there. And the investors were no longer pretending to be neutral. One of them reached for the contract, flipping to the pages she had referenced, scanning quickly, his expression changing from polite interest to something closer to concern. And Daniel felt it then, not the loss of control, not yet, but the shift in attention, the way the room had quietly moved away from him and toward her, and it was subtle, almost invisible, but undeniable. And for a moment, he said nothing, just watched her. This waitress who spoke as if she had sat at tables like this before, who corrected million-dollar mistakes without raising her voice, who did not seem to care whether he believed her or not. And that, more than anything, unsettled him, because people usually wanted something, recognition, approval, opportunity, but she stood there as if she needed none of it, and when she finished, she stepped back slightly, returning the space to him, not claiming it, not holding it, just leaving it there. And one of the investors cleared his throat quietly. "Mr. Hayes," he said, choosing his words carefully, "perhaps we should review this section again." And Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze still fixed on Clara, and for the first time, there was no dismissal in his eyes, only calculation, and something else, something quieter, something he was not ready to name. "Stay," he said, not as a command this time, but almost as a request, and Clara paused, just for a second, before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if she had been expecting that too, as if this moment, this exact shift, had happened before, just not here, not in a place where she was supposed to be invisible, and somewhere beneath the polished surface of the evening, something deeper had begun to surface, something that had been hidden in plain sight all along. Daniel did not sit back down immediately, his hand still resting on the edge of the table as if the decision in front of him had suddenly become heavier than the paper it was printed on. And for the first time that evening, he looked at the contract not as a formality, but as something alive, something capable of shifting beneath him. And across from him, the investors were no longer waiting, they were watching. Their earlier confidence replaced by a quiet calculation that mirrored his own. And Clara stood just behind his chair again, not closer, not further, exactly where she had been before, but now the space felt different, charged with a kind of awareness that had not existed 10 minutes earlier. And Daniel picked up the contract slowly, flipping back to the first page she had referenced, his eyes scanning the line again. This time not trusting memory, not trusting assumption. And when he spoke, his voice had changed, not softer, not kinder, just more precise. "Explain it again," he said, and Clara did not hesitate. She leaned slightly forward, just enough to see the text clearly, and repeated the phrase in Arabic, slower this time, breaking it into parts, translating each segment with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. And as she spoke, one of the investors nodded almost imperceptibly, confirming what she was saying without interrupting, and Daniel felt something shift again, deeper now, not just in the room, but in himself, because he was used to control, to certainty, to being the one others looked to for answers. And now, without raising her voice, without demanding attention, she had taken that position from him, not by force, not by status, but by understanding, and that was something he could not ignore. "And the rest," he said, gesturing toward the other pages, and Clara moved through them one by one, not rushing, not over-explaining, just pointing out the inconsistencies, the subtle traps hidden behind elegant phrasing, each correction precise, each explanation grounded. And the more she spoke, the quieter the table became, until even the background noise of the restaurant seemed distant, as if the entire room had narrowed to the space between her voice and the contract. And when she finished, she stepped back again, the same small movement, the same quiet retreat, as if she had never intended to stay in the center of it. And for a long moment, no one said anything. And then Daniel closed the folder slowly, the sound soft but final, and leaned back in his chair, his gaze lifting to meet the investors across from him. "We will need to revise this," he said, and the words were simple, but the meaning behind them was not, because in his world, a statement like that was not just a suggestion, it was a shift in power, and the investors exchanged a glance before one of them nodded. "Of course," he replied, his tone careful now, respectful in a way it had not been earlier, and the meeting, as it had been planned, was over, not with a signature, but with a pause, and Daniel exhaled quietly, his attention returning, not to the contract, not to the investors, but to Clara, and for the first time, he turned fully in his chair to face her, not partially, not dismissively, but completely, and there was no arrogance in his expression now, only focus. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, and it was not a challenge, not an accusation, just a question. And Clara held his gaze for a second, then another, before answering. "Different places," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, something that suggested a story without offering it, a history that was not meant for this moment. And Daniel studied her, noting the way she did not elaborate, did not fill the silence, did not try to turn this into an opportunity, and that, more than anything, confirmed what he had already begun to suspect, that she was not here by accident, not in the way he had first assumed. And around them, the restaurant slowly returned to its rhythm, conversations resuming, glasses clinking, the piano continuing its quiet melody. But at table 12, something had already changed, something that would not return to what it had been. And as one of the investors stood to leave, offering a polite nod to Daniel, his eyes flickered briefly toward Clara, not with curiosity, but with respect, the kind that is given carefully, earned quietly. And Daniel noticed that too, because respect, in his world, was currency, and she had just acquired it without asking, without trying, without even seeming to care. And as the table cleared, as the contract was set aside, as the meeting dissolved into the ordinary flow of the evening, Daniel remained seated for a moment longer, watching her as she reached for a nearby glass, resuming her work as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just altered the course of a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And that was when it settled, not as a realization, but as a quiet certainty, that the woman he had dismissed minutes ago was not just someone who understood languages. She understood something far more dangerous, something he had built his entire life around, and somehow forgotten how to recognize. Clara moved away from the table with the same quiet efficiency she had shown all evening, her hands steady as she gathered empty glasses, her posture unchanged, as if nothing remarkable had just happened. And yet Daniel did not return to his phone, did not call his assistant, did not immediately resume control of his evening the way he always did. Instead he watched her, not openly, not obviously, but with a focus that followed her across the room, tracking the small details he had missed. Before, the way she anticipated a guest reaching for water before they asked, the way she adjusted a plate slightly so it aligned perfectly with the edge of the table, the way she listened more than she spoke, and it unsettled him, not because she was extraordinary in a loud or dramatic way, but because she was precise, deliberate, and entirely self-contained, and people like that did not usually end up here, not in a place where their skills went unnoticed, not in a role designed to make them invisible. And Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table, his fingers interlocked as he considered what had just happened, replaying her words, her tone, the effortless shift between languages that had not felt like performance, but like instinct, and instinct could not be faked, not at that level, not under pressure, and across the room. Clara paused briefly at another table, offering a polite smile, her voice soft again, indistinguishable now from any other server. And that contrast made something tighten in his chest, because he understood masks, he understood roles, he had built entire negotiations around reading them, and hers was the first one that had slipped just enough for him to see what was underneath, and he did not like not knowing. Daniel, one of the investors said quietly as he gathered his coat, "We will await your revisions," and Daniel nodded without looking at him, his attention still fixed elsewhere. "You will have them," he replied, his tone automatic, controlled, and the investors left without further discussion, their earlier confidence replaced by a careful respect that lingered even as they walked away. And when the table was finally empty, when the contract was closed and set aside, when the evening should have returned to its predictable rhythm, Daniel remained seated, still, silent, as if the next move required more thought than he was used to giving. And then, slowly, he stood, adjusting his jacket with the same habitual precision. But there was a pause now, a hesitation in his movement, not uncertainty, but intention, and he walked across the dining room, not quickly, not dramatically, just with a quiet purpose that did not need to announce itself. And Clara noticed him before he reached her. Of course she did. The slight shift in her posture gave it away. The way her attention narrowed just enough to acknowledge his approach without turning fully toward it. And when he stopped beside her, she finished placing a glass on the table before looking up, meeting his gaze with that same calm, unreadable expression. "You cost me a signature tonight," he said. And the words could have been accusation, could have been irritation, but they were not. They were observation, and Clara tilted her head slightly, considering him. "Or I saved you from one," she replied, and there was no challenge in her voice, no need to prove the point. Just a quiet statement that settled between them, and Daniel let out a small breath, almost a laugh, though it carried no humor, only acknowledgement. "You assume I would not have caught it," he said, and Clara's eyes held his for a moment longer than necessary. "You did not," she answered, simply, and there it was again, that clarity, that refusal to soften the truth to make it easier to accept, and Daniel felt it, not as offense, but as something sharper, something that cut through the usual layers of conversation he was used to navigating, and for a second, neither of them spoke, the space between them quiet but not uncomfortable, just real. And then Daniel reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a card, holding it between his fingers without offering it yet. "I could use someone who sees what others miss," he said, his tone steady, measured, the language of opportunity returning to him like muscle memory, and Clara's gaze dropped briefly to the card, then back to his face, and she did not take it, not immediately, not the way most people would have, and that hesitation, that refusal to move too quickly, made something shift again, deeper this time, because for the first time that evening, Daniel Hayes realized that whatever this was, whatever she represented, it was not something he could simply acquire. Not with money, not with status, not with the tools he had spent his entire life mastering. And Clara spoke softly, her voice almost lost beneath the music again. You already have people like that, she said, and Daniel's brow tightened slightly. Clearly, I do not, he replied, and Clara gave the smallest hint of a smile, not amused, not impressed, just knowing. You do, she said. You just do not listen to them. And the words lingered, not loud, not dramatic, but heavier than anything else she had said. And for a moment, Daniel did not respond, did not counter, did not deflect. He simply stood there, holding the card, as if weighing something far more complex than an offer. And somewhere between the quiet music and the soft glow of the lights, the balance of power shifted again, not in the room, but in him. Daniel did not pull his hand back right away. The card still suspended between them as if the decision to offer it had already been made, but the outcome had not. And Clara's words lingered longer than they should have, echoing in a place he usually kept guarded, because he had built his reputation on seeing what others missed, on acting faster, thinking sharper, moving ahead of hesitation, and yet here she was, quietly pointing out something far simpler, something almost inconvenient in its truth, that perhaps the problem was not what he could see, but what he chose not to hear, and that realization did not sit comfortably with him. So he straightened slightly, reclaiming a bit of that familiar composure. And you listen to everything, he said, not dismissive, not mocking, just testing, and Clara's gaze softened just a fraction, not in warmth, but in understanding. No, she replied, only the things that matter, and the simplicity of that answer left no room for argument, no angle to push against, just a quiet boundary that he had not expected to encounter here. And for a moment, Daniel said nothing, his eyes studying her more carefully now, not as a potential hire, not as a curiosity, but as someone who had just refused the language he understood best, the language of leverage, of offers, of transactions. And that refusal did not come with defiance or pride. It came with calm, and calm was far more difficult to negotiate with, because it did not react, it did not bend under pressure, it simply remained. And that, more than anything, shifted the balance again. So slowly, almost imperceptibly, he lowered his hand, slipping the card back into his pocket without comment, without insistence, and Clara noticed. Of course she did. The smallest change in her posture acknowledging it, not as victory, not as defiance, just as something that had been resolved without needing to be spoken, and for the first time. That evening, Daniel felt something unfamiliar settle in the space between them, not control, not advantage, but respect, quiet and unannounced, and it did not come from what she had said, but from what she had not taken, and around them. The restaurant continued as it always did, servers moving, conversations flowing, the piano shifting into a slower piece that seemed to stretch the moment just a little longer. And Clara glanced toward another table where a guest was raising a hand slightly, signaling for attention, and she nodded gently, a silent acknowledgement before returning her focus to Daniel. Your guest will expect an answer, she said, her voice returning to that neutral, professional tone, as if stepping back into the role the world recognized. And Daniel followed her glance briefly, then back to her, and for the first time, he noticed something else, something that had been there all along but had not mattered until now. The faint crease at the edge of her sleeve, the small notebook tucked into her apron pocket, worn at the corners, used often, not decorative, and details mattered to him. They always had, but these details did not fit the picture he had assumed, and assumptions, he was beginning to realize, had cost him more than just a signature tonight. You do not belong here, he said, the words leaving him before he could reshape them into something more neutral. And Clara did not react the way most would, did not take offense, did not interpret it as insult or praise. She simply held his gaze and answered, everyone belongs somewhere. And then, after a brief pause, added, this is where I am right now. And there was no apology in that, no explanation, just acceptance. And Daniel exhaled quietly, his attention sharpening again, because that answer, like the others, revealed just enough without offering anything he could use, and he realized then that whatever her story was, it was not one she would hand over easily. not in exchange for opportunity, not in exchange for curiosity, and that made him want to understand it more, not as a negotiation, but as a question he could not yet solve. And for a man who had built an empire on answers, that was rare. "What if where you are is a waste?" he said, testing the edge again, not pushing, just observing. And Clara's expression remained unchanged, steady, grounded. "Then it is a temporary one," she replied, and for a second, something almost like a smile touched the corner of her lips. Not for him, not for the situation, but for the thought itself, and then it was gone, replaced by that same quiet composure, and she stepped back slightly, creating space again, the conversation closing without announcement, and Daniel watched her as she turned, moving toward the next table, her presence folding seamlessly back into the rhythm of the room, as if she had never stepped outside of it at all, and yet everything about him told him otherwise, that nothing about this was ordinary, not her, not the moment, not the way his own perspective had shifted without permission. And as he stood there, alone for a brief second in the middle of a room full of people, Daniel Hayes understood something he had not expected to learn tonight. That power was not always loud, not always visible, and sometimes it did not ask to be noticed at all. Daniel did not leave right away. Even after Clara moved on and the space between them returned to something that looked ordinary from the outside, because ordinary no longer felt accurate, not after what had just unfolded, and he stood there for a moment longer than necessary, his attention following her as she moved through the room, not in a way that drew attention, but in the quiet, deliberate way of someone observing patterns. And the more he watched, the more the details aligned into something clearer, something that did not match the role she was playing, because Clara did not rush, did not react, did not fill silence with unnecessary words. She moved with intention, each step measured, each interaction precise, and that kind of control did not come from practice alone. It came from experience, from having stood in rooms where words carried consequences far beyond a dinner table, and Daniel knew those rooms well. He had built his life inside them, and yet here she was, moving through a different world with the same awareness, the same restraint, and it did not make sense. And when something did not make sense, he did not ignore it, he investigated it. But this was different, because for the first time in a long time, he hesitated, not because he lacked information, but because he recognized that information might not be freely given. And that thought lingered as he finally turned toward the exit, adjusting his jacket, stepping into the cooler air outside the restaurant where the city moved at its usual pace, unaware of the small shift that had just taken place inside, and his driver opened the door without a word, the routine familiar, predictable, everything returning to its expected order. But Daniel did not get in immediately. He paused, one hand resting lightly against the door, his gaze unfocused for a second as the evening replayed itself, not the deal, not the numbers, but her voice, the way it had cut through assumption without force, the way it had revealed what he had overlooked, and that was the part that stayed with him, not the correction itself, but the fact that he had needed it, and slowly he slid into the back seat, the door closing with a soft, controlled sound, and as the car moved through the city, past lights and reflections that blurred together in the window, he reached into his pocket, pulling out the card he had not given her, turning it between his fingers as if the object itself carried more weight than it should, and for a moment, he considered what would have happened if she had taken it, if she had accepted the offer without hesitation, how easily that would have fit into the patterns he understood, the outcomes he could predict, and yet she had not. She had stepped away from that path without resistance, without explanation, and that refusal had created something far more complicated than acceptance ever could. And Daniel leaned back slightly, his eyes closing for just a second, not in exhaustion, but in thought, because there was a question forming now, not about her skills, not about her value, but about her choice. Why someone who clearly understood so much would remain where she was? And the answer did not come quickly, not the way answers usually did for him. It lingered, incomplete, and somewhere between the movement of the car and the quiet hum of the city outside, another realization settled in, quieter than the first, but just as sharp, that perhaps she was not the one out of place. Perhaps he was, not in the restaurant, not in his world, but in the way he had approached it, in the assumptions he had carried without question, and that Thought did not sit comfortably, but it did not disappear either. And as the car turned onto a quieter street, Daniel opened his eyes again, his gaze steady now, more focused than before, because whatever this was, whatever she had revealed, it was not something he could ignore, not this time, not after what he had seen. And as the city continued to move around him, unchanged, predictable, Daniel Hayes made a decision that did not come from instinct or strategy, but from something far less familiar, something closer to curiosity. And it was simple, almost understated in its weight, but it shifted everything that would come next, because for the first time in years, he was not thinking about how to close a deal, he was thinking about how to understand a person, and that was a different kind of challenge entirely. The next morning did not arrive with urgency, but with clarity, the kind that settles quietly before the world has fully caught up to it. And Daniel was already awake before the sunlight reached the glass walls of his apartment, standing near the window with a cup of coffee he had not touched, his reflection faint against the skyline. Because his mind had not rested in the way it usually did, it had turned, slowly, deliberately, revisiting the same moment from different angles, not searching for a mistake, but for meaning, and that alone marked the difference. Because Daniel Hayes did not dwell on people, he assessed them, categorized them, moved on. But Clara Whitmore did not fit into any category he trusted, and that unsettled him in a way that felt less like discomfort and more like disruption. And behind him, his phone buzzed once on the marble counter, a message from his assistant, a reminder of meetings, calls, revisions that demanded his attention, the world waiting for him to resume his role. But he did not turn toward it immediately. Instead, he took a slow breath, setting the untouched coffee aside, because something else had taken priority, something he had not planned for. And when he finally reached for his phone, it was not to respond to the schedule, it was to open a different line, a quieter one that did not involve boardrooms or investors. "I need information," he said simply when the call connected, his voice low, controlled, but carrying a weight that made the person on the other end pause for half a second, recognizing the shift. "Clara Whitmore," Daniel continued, and there was a brief silence, the kind that comes not from confusion, but from recalibration, because requests like this usually came with context, with urgency tied to risk or opportunity. But this one did not. It stood alone, and that made it unusual. "What kind of information?" the voice asked carefully, and Daniel looked out at the city for a moment before answering. "Everything." And the word was quiet, but precise. And then he ended the call, not waiting for confirmation, because he already knew it would be handled. It always was. And yet as he set the phone down, there was no satisfaction in the action, no sense of control regained, only a quiet awareness that this approach, this method he had relied on for years, might not give him what he was actually looking for, because Clara had not revealed herself through facts or history. She had revealed herself through presence, through the way she listened, the way she spoke, the way she chose what mattered and what did not. And those were not things that could be summarized in a report, not in any way that would explain what he had seen. And that realization lingered as he moved through the morning. The routine unfolding around him with its usual precision, meetings scheduled, calls made, decisions executed, everything functioning exactly as it should. And yet beneath it all, there was a quiet dissonance, a sense that something essential had shifted, not in his world, but in the way he moved through it. And hours later, as the afternoon light softened against the glass buildings of the city, Daniel found himself doing something he had not planned, something he had not scheduled. He changed direction, his driver glancing briefly in the rearview mirror as the destination shifted, not questioning, just adjusting. And the car moved through familiar streets, past places that had always been part of the background, unnoticed, until now. And when it stopped, Daniel did not hesitate this time. He stepped out, the air cooler than the night before, sharper, clearer, and the restaurant stood exactly as it had, unchanged, its doors opening and closing with the same quiet rhythm, the same flow of people moving in and out. And for a moment, he stood there, just outside, not as the man who had walked in the night before, not with the same assumptions, the same certainty, but with something else, something quieter, something closer to intention. And then he stepped inside, the familiar warmth meeting him again, the soft music, the low conversations, Everything exactly as it should be, and yet not the same. Because now he was looking for something, not a deal, not an advantage, but a person. And across the room, behind the movement and the noise, Clara was there, just as she had been, moving through the space with that same quiet precision. And for the first time, Daniel Hayes understood that returning was not about control, it was about acknowledgement, because some moments do not end when you leave them, they wait, and when you come back, they are still there, unchanged, ready to reveal something you missed the first time. Daniel did not announce his presence when he entered, did not look around for recognition or acknowledgement, because for once, he was not interested in being seen, he was interested in seeing, and the restaurant unfolded before him the same way it had the night before, warm lights spilling across polished tables, quiet conversations layered over soft piano notes, the rhythm steady, predictable, almost unchanged, and yet his attention moved differently now, not scanning for status or influence, but searching for something far more specific. And he found her quickly, not because she stood out, but because she did not, because Clara Whitmore blended into the space in a way that required intention to notice, and once noticed, could not be ignored, and she moved the same way she had before, measured, deliberate, her presence defined not by visibility, but by control. And Daniel paused just inside the entrance for a second longer than necessary, not hesitating, but observing. Because this time he was not walking into a meeting, he was stepping into a moment he had already misunderstood once, and he had no intention of repeating that mistake. And as he approached, Clara did not look up immediately, her focus on a table where she was setting down a glass of water, her movements precise, unhurried, and when she did turn, it was not with surprise, not with curiosity, but with recognition that carried no weight, as if his return had been anticipated in a way she did not need to question. "You came back," she said, her voice quiet, neutral, and Daniel stopped just short of the table, meeting her gaze without the usual distance he maintained with others. "I did," he replied, and there was no explanation offered, no justification, just acknowledgement, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them holding something unspoken but understood. And Clara gestured slightly toward an empty table near the window. "Would you like to sit?" she asked, the words simple, professional, but the tone beneath them carried something else, something closer to invitation than obligation, and Daniel nodded once, moving toward the table without hesitation, because this time, he was not here to lead the conversation, he was here to understand it. And as he sat down, the city outside stretched beyond. The glass, distant, controlled, a reflection of the world he knew. But inside, the atmosphere was different, quieter, more contained, and Clara placed a glass of water in front of him, the same way she had for countless others, the same way she had the night before. But now the action carried a different weight, not because it had changed, but because he had, and he watched her for a second, not as a subject of curiosity, but as a presence he was trying to read without assumptions. And when she turned to leave, he spoke, not to stop her, but to begin. "I asked for information about you this morning," he said, his voice steady, not confrontational, not apologetic, just honest. And Clara paused, not surprised, not offended, just still, as if the statement had confirmed something she already knew, and she turned back slowly, her eyes meeting his with that same calm clarity. "And did you find what you were looking for?" she asked, and Daniel leaned back slightly, considering the question, not as a challenge, but as a reflection of something deeper. "No," he said after a moment, and the words settled between them with a kind of quiet finality, because for someone like him, not finding answers was rare, and admitting it was even rarer. And Clara studied him for a second, her expression unreadable but attentive, and then she gave the smallest nod, as if acknowledging not the failure, but the honesty behind it. And Daniel continued, not pressing, not demanding, just following the line of thought that had brought him back here. "It turns out information does not explain presence," he said, and Clara's gaze softened just slightly, not in emotion, but in recognition, and she moved to the chair across from him, not sitting fully, just resting her hand lightly against the back of it, creating a space that was neither formal nor distant, and for the first time, the conversation felt balanced, not defined by roles, not limited by expectation, but shaped by something quieter, something that did not need to be named to be understood, and outside. The city continued as it always did, unaware, unchanged, but inside, at that table near the window, the dynamic had shifted again, not in power, not in control, but in perspective, because Daniel Hayes was no longer trying to prove something, and Clara Whitmore had never needed to. Clara did not sit down, not fully, her hand still resting lightly against the back of the chair, as if she understood that whatever this conversation was becoming, it did not belong to either of their worlds entirely, and Daniel noticed that, the way she maintained just enough distance to remain grounded in her role, and yet did not retreat from the moment, and that balance, that quiet control, held his attention more than anything she had said, because it was not something he could replicate. With strategy, it came from something internal, something practiced in ways he could not yet define, and he leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table, not in authority, not in negotiation, but in focus. Then what explains it? He asked, his voice lower now, not demanding an answer, but inviting one, and Clara's gaze shifted briefly toward the window, the city beyond it moving in soft reflections, before returning to him, and when she spoke, her tone was measured, deliberate, as if choosing words that were not meant to impress, but to land. Experience does, she said, and the word was simple, but it carried weight, the kind that did not need elaboration to be understood, and Daniel considered that, his expression tightening just slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition, because experience was something he valued, something he trusted, but it was also something that could not be transferred, could not be purchased, could not be rushed, and for the first time, he found himself asking a question without knowing what answer he expected. What kind of experience? He said, and Clara did not answer immediately, not because she did not know, but because she chose not to, and that pause was intentional, a quiet boundary drawn without explanation, and then she shifted the conversation instead, not away, but deeper, the kind that teaches you what matters before you are asked to prove it. She replied, and Daniel's eyes held hers, the meaning settling in. Slowly, because this was not about language, not really. It was about discernment, about knowing where to look and what to listen for. And he realized then that what had unsettled him the night before was not her knowledge. It was her clarity, the way she had seen something he had overlooked not because she was smarter, but because she was paying attention in a way he had stopped doing. And that realization did not come with discomfort this time. It came with something quieter, something closer to understanding, and he exhaled softly, leaning back just slightly, allowing the thought to settle without pushing against it. You saw something I did not, he said, not as a statement of defeat, but as acknowledgement, and Clara gave a small nod, not accepting credit, not dismissing it, just recognizing the truth of it, and for a moment, the conversation rested there, not moving forward, not needing to, because something had already shifted beneath it, and then Daniel spoke again, his voice steady, but different now, less guarded, more direct. Why stay? He asked, and the question was not about the restaurant, not about the job. It was about the choice, the one that did not align with the skills she had revealed, and Clara understood that immediately, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, and when she answered, her voice carried that same quiet certainty that had defined everything she had said so far. Because leaving is not always progress, she said, and Daniel's brow tightened slightly, not in confusion, but in thought, because that idea did not fit the framework he had built his life on, where movement meant growth, where change meant advancement, and yet there was something in the way she said it that suggested a different kind of logic, one that did not rely on outward markers, and he leaned forward again, not pressing, but engaging. Then what is? He asked, and Clara's gaze softened just slightly, not in emotion, but in clarity. Understanding when to move and when to stay, she replied, and the answer did not come with explanation. It did not need one, because it was not meant to be analyzed. It was meant to be recognized, and Daniel sat with that for a moment, the words settling into a place he had not visited in a long time, because for years, his decisions had been driven by momentum, by forward motion, by the constant push toward more, and now, for the first time, he was considering the possibility that stillness could carry its own kind of strength, and that thought did not challenge him. It expanded something, quietly, without resistance, and Clara straightened slightly, her attention shifting back toward the room, the responsibilities of her role returning to the surface. But before she stepped away, she looked at him once more, her expression unchanged, steady, and said, "You do not need more information," she said softly. "You need to listen differently." And then she turned, moving back into the rhythm of the restaurant, leaving the words behind, not as advice, not as instruction, but as something simpler, something that would either be understood or ignored. And Daniel remained seated, his gaze following her for a moment before returning to the glass of water in front of him, untouched, and for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about what to say next. He was thinking about what he had just heard, and whether he had ever really been listening at all. Daniel did not reach for the water in front of him, even though it had been placed there minutes ago, untouched, the surface still, reflecting the soft light above, and he found himself staring at it longer than necessary, not because it mattered, but because it gave him something neutral to focus on while everything else settled, because Clara's words had not been loud, had not been forceful, and yet they had shifted something deeper than any argument ever had. And he sat there, still, his posture relaxed, but his mind moving in ways it had not in years, not calculating outcomes, not anticipating responses, but replaying a simple sentence, listening differently. And for someone who had built his entire career on speaking, on directing, on leading conversations toward outcomes he controlled, the idea felt unfamiliar, almost counterintuitive, and yet it did not feel wrong. It felt incomplete, as if it had been missing from something he had assumed was already whole. And across the room, Clara continued moving through the space with that same quiet rhythm, her presence steady, unchanging, and Daniel noticed now what he had overlooked before, not just how she spoke, but when she chose not to, the way she allowed silence to exist without filling it, the way she listened fully before responding. And it struck him then that what she had shown him was not just knowledge, it was restraint. And restraint was something he had not practiced in a long time, not in conversation, not in decision-making, because speed had always been his advantage, and now he was beginning to see what it had cost him. And slowly, he leaned forward, his fingers brushing lightly against the glass, finally lifting it, taking a small sip, not out of habit, but awareness, as if even that simple action carried a different weight now. And when he set it back down, the sound was quiet, deliberate, and for a moment, he allowed himself to sit in the silence that followed, not resisting it, not trying to move past it, just staying there. And it was unfamiliar, but not uncomfortable, just different, and that difference was enough to hold his attention. And then, without urgency, without the usual sense of control guiding the moment, he looked up again, his gaze finding Clara across the room, and this time, he did not call out to her, did not signal, did not interrupt her work. He waited, not passively, but intentionally, allowing her to finish what she was doing, allowing the moment to arrive instead of forcing it. And when she eventually turned in his direction, her eyes meeting his from across the space, there was no surprise there, no question, just recognition, and she walked over at her own pace, unhurried, her presence steady as she reached the table. "Is there something else you need?" she asked, her tone returning to that professional neutrality. But Daniel heard something different beneath it now, not distance, but clarity, and he shook his head slightly. "No," he said, and then paused, not searching for the right words, but choosing them carefully. "I just wanted to listen." And the statement was simple, almost understated, but it carried more weight than anything he had said before, because it was not about her, not about what she could offer or explain. It was about what he was willing to change, and Clara studied him for a brief moment, her expression unreadable, but her eyes attentive, and then she gave a small nod, not approving, not affirming, just acknowledging. And she did not speak immediately. She allowed the silence to exist again, the same way she had before, and this time, Daniel did not move to fill it. He let it remain, steady, present, and after a moment, Clara spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Then do not ask," she said, and Daniel's brow shifted slightly, not in confusion, but in curiosity, and she continued, "Just pay attention," and the words settled between them with a quiet finality, not as instruction, but as something closer to an invitation, and Daniel leaned back slightly, his gaze steady, His posture relaxed in a way it had not been before, because for the first time, he was not trying to direct where this would go. He was allowing it to unfold, and that shift, small as it seemed, changed everything about the way the moment felt, and Clara stepped back again, returning to her work, her role, her rhythm, and Daniel remained where he was, not waiting for something to happen, not expecting a result, just present, and as the minutes passed, the room moved around him. Conversations rising and falling, glasses clinking, the piano continuing its quiet melody, and through it all, he began to notice what he had missed before, the subtle exchanges between people, the small pauses, the unspoken signals that shaped the flow of the room, and it was not dramatic. It was not obvious, but it was there, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel Hayes was not leading the moment, he was inside it, and that, more than anything, was new. Time moved without urgency, but something within it had shifted, and Daniel remained at the table longer than he had intended, not because he had nowhere else to be, but because for once, he was not measuring time by productivity or outcome. He was letting it unfold, and that alone felt unfamiliar enough to hold him there. And as he sat, observing without intervening, something else began to surface, something quieter, something that did not come from Clara's words, but from what they revealed about himself, because he started to notice patterns not just in the room, but in his own behavior, the way he had always filled silence with direction, the way he had interpreted hesitation as weakness, the way he had mistaken speed for clarity, and those realizations did not arrive all at once. They emerged slowly, in small, almost unremarkable moments, like the way a man at a nearby table paused before answering his companion, choosing his words instead of reacting, or the way a server adjusted her pace to match the rhythm of a conversation rather than interrupt it. And Daniel saw it now, the difference between control and awareness, between leading and understanding, and it unsettled him, not because it challenged his success, but because it revealed how narrow his approach had been. And across the room, Clara continued her work, but now, every movement she made carried context, every pause had intention, and Daniel realized that what he had mistaken for simplicity was actually discipline, the kind that came from knowing when to act and when to wait. And that realization settled into him with a quiet weight, because it was not something he could dismiss. It was something he recognized as true, and after a while, Clara approached again, not because he had called her, but because the moment had naturally returned to him, her presence steady as she stopped beside the table. "You have not ordered," she said softly, her tone neutral, but her eyes attentive, and Daniel looked up at her, a faint shift in his expression, not amusement, not indifference, but something closer to reflection. "I was not hungry," he replied, and the words were simple, but they carried something unspoken, because it was not food he had come back for. And Clara seemed to understand that without needing clarification, her gaze holding his for a second before she nodded slightly. And there was a pause, not empty, but full, the kind that did not require filling. And then Daniel spoke again, his voice quieter now, more measured than before. "You said I need to listen differently," he said, not as a question, but as a continuation. And Clara did not interrupt, did not correct. She simply waited, and he continued, "I think I have been listening for answers." And he paused, the thought forming as he spoke it. Not for understanding. And Clara's expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted, not approval, not surprise, just recognition. And she gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, as if acknowledging that he had reached something on his own. And Daniel leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting briefly toward the window before returning to her. "And I have been asking the wrong questions," he added. And this time, Clara spoke, her voice calm, steady. "Or asking too many," she said, and the words landed with quiet precision. And Daniel let out a soft breath, something between a sigh and a release, because that felt true in a way that did not require defense. And for a moment, neither of them spoke again, the conversation resting in that space, where meaning had already been exchanged. And then Clara stepped back slightly, her attention shifting toward another table. But before she moved away completely, she said, "Understanding does not come from control," she said, her voice soft but clear. "It comes from presence." And then she turned, returning to her work without waiting for a response, because she did not need one. And Daniel remained where he was, her words settling into him with a weight that felt both unfamiliar and necessary. And as he sat there, in the middle of a room that had not changed, he realized that something within him had, not dramatically, not completely, but enough to matter, because for the first time in a long time, he was not trying to shape the moment into something useful. He was allowing it to be what it was, and that shift, quiet as it seemed, carried more impact than any decision he had made in years. The moment did not end when Clara walked away. It settled, quietly, like something placed carefully on a surface that had not been used in a long time, and Daniel remained seated, not out of indecision, but because leaving now would have felt like interrupting something that had not finished forming yet. And for once, he allowed that feeling to exist without questioning it, without trying to define it. And as he sat there, the room around him continued in its steady rhythm, conversations flowing, glasses touching softly, the piano shifting into a slower, almost reflective melody, and it matched something within him, something that had begun to slow down as well, not in weakness, but in awareness. And he realized that for years, he had moved through moments without staying in them, always stepping ahead, always reaching for the next decision, the next outcome, and now, for the first time, he was allowing a moment to complete itself before moving on, and that alone felt like a shift, subtle but undeniable. And after a while, he stood, not abruptly, not with purpose tied to urgency, just with intention, and he adjusted his jacket out of habit, though even that gesture felt less automatic now, more conscious, and he looked across the room, his gaze finding Clara again, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to acknowledge something that had changed, and she was at another table, speaking softly. With a couple seated near the far wall, her tone calm, her posture composed, and there was nothing about the interaction that stood out to anyone else, but Daniel saw it now. The way she listened fully before responding, the way her presence seemed to steady the conversation without taking control of it, and it struck him then that what she had shown him was not a skill, it was a way of being, and that was not something that could be taught in a meeting or outlined in a report. It was something that had to be lived, practiced, understood over time, and as he walked toward the exit, he did not rush, did not check his phone, did not pull himself back into the pace he had left behind. He simply moved through the space, aware of it, aware of himself within it. And when he reached the door, he paused for a second, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because this place, this ordinary restaurant, had revealed something that his boardrooms never had, and that realization carried a quiet weight. And just before he stepped outside, Clara looked up, not directly at him, not in a way that called attention, but their eyes met briefly across the room, and there was no gesture, no signal, just a moment of understanding that did not need to be confirmed. And Daniel gave the smallest nod, not as thanks, not as farewell, but as acknowledgement, and Clara returned it just as subtly, her expression unchanged, her presence steady. And then he stepped out into the evening air, the city, moving around him as it always did, lights shifting, people passing, everything continuing without pause. But he did not move immediately. He stood there for a moment, feeling the difference between where he had been and where he was now, not in location, but in perspective. And when his driver approached, opening the door as usual, Daniel did not speak right away. He looked out at the street, at the movement, at the rhythm he had once controlled so easily, and then he got into the car, the door closing softly behind him. And as it pulled away, he did not reach for his phone, did not call for updates, did not return to the constant flow of decisions waiting for him. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his gaze steady, his thoughts clear in a way that did not come from answers, but from understanding. And for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about what he would do next. He was thinking about how he would do it differently. And that question, quiet and open, carried more weight than any plan he had ever made. The city lights moved past the window in quiet streaks of gold and white, reflections shifting across the glass as the car carried Daniel through streets he had traveled 1,000 times before. But this time, the familiarity did not bring comfort, it brought contrast, because everything outside remained the same, while something inside him had changed in a way he could not ignore. And he sat there, not reaching for his phone, not reviewing schedules or decisions, just present, the silence in the car no longer something to fill, but something to keep, and for the first time in years, he allowed a thought to settle without turning it into action, because not everything needed to be solved. Some things needed to be understood, and Clara's voice returned to him, not as an echo, but as something grounded, something that had already taken hold, and he realized that what she had given him was not an answer, it was a shift, a different way of seeing what had always been there, and that realization did not feel dramatic. It felt quiet, steady, lasting. And when the car finally slowed in front of his building, the door opened as it always did, but Daniel did not step out immediately. He paused for just a second, not out of hesitation, but awareness, and then he stepped onto the sidewalk, the cool evening air meeting him again, sharper now, clearer, and he looked up briefly at the structure in front of him, the glass, the height, the reflection of a life built on precision and control, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to measure it, to define it. He simply saw it, and that alone felt different. And as he entered the building, the quiet efficiency of the lobby greeted him, the familiar nods, the recognition that followed him wherever he went, but he moved through it without absorbing it, without letting it define the moment, because his attention was no longer on how he was perceived, it was on how he perceived, and that shift, subtle as it seemed, changed the weight of everything around him, and later, standing once again by the window in his apartment, the city stretching endlessly below, Daniel did not think about the deal he had postponed. He did not think about the opportunities waiting for him the next day. He thought about a moment in a quiet restaurant, about a voice that had not raised itself but had still been heard, about a presence that had not demanded attention but had changed everything it touched, and he understood now that power did not always announce itself. It did not always arrive with certainty or control. Sometimes it appeared quietly, in the form of someone who simply refused to be defined by what others assumed. And that kind of power could not be bought, could not be assigned, it could only be recognized. And Daniel exhaled slowly, his reflection faint against the glass, not as a man who had been corrected, but as someone who had been reminded of something he had forgotten, something simple, something essential. And as the city continued to move beneath him, unchanged, constant, he allowed that realization to settle without turning it into a plan, without reducing it to a strategy, because not everything needed to be used, some things needed to be kept, and somewhere, in a quiet restaurant that would continue its rhythm long after this night, Clara Whitmore would still be there, not waiting, not expecting, simply present, and that was enough, because the lesson had already been given, not through instruction, not through force, but through example, and it would remain long after the moment had passed, carried not in words, but in the way it changed what came after, because sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do is not to speak louder, but to speak only when it matters, and to remain silent when it does not.